So we're from the Wits LCT Hub, and it's a group of academics and students and teachers, and we meet every Wednesday to read LCT, to learn LCT, and to discuss how it informs our teaching and our research. And two of our members, Nick West and Shimpa Moch, have recently used LCT to get their MEds, their master's degrees. So we thought that this would be a wonderful opportunity to look at their studies and to see how they talk to one another. So we took up a challenge in knowledge building. Carl writes that studies that enact LCT should be able to speak to one another through the theory. And Nick's research and Shimpa's research, which they presented at the Wits Hub while they were busy with their studies, they presented a couple of times, were very, very different studies, different fields, different contexts. Nick's was a self-study. Shimpa worked with teachers, very different data sources, and they were using very different, they were using different LCT dimensions. So on the surface of it, it looked like they were completely different studies addressing completely different issues. But we were challenged to think about how LCT could enable a discussion between the two studies. And we came to the realization that both of them were actually addressing the same issue about what happens when social agents don't have the gaze that's required of them. And that's what we're going to explore in this round table. A little bit later on, you'll see why when we go through the discussion of these two different research projects, we felt that it was important to bring in just a third case to open up possibilities so that we can really think about this idea about what happens when social actors don't have the gaze required of them. So a little bit later, I'm going to be speaking about higher education and the roads must fall protests. So what are we going to do in this round table? I'm going to first introduce subjective relations of the social field. Then we're going to look at three cases where actors did not possess the gaze that was valued by the institution. So Nick's going to talk about electrical engineering as an electrical engineer who became a teacher of engineering. Shimpa's going to talk about non-Jewish subject teachers who teach in a Jewish school, and then I will talk very briefly about the roads must fall protests. And then we're going to consider how did the institutions respond and how did the actors respond. So let's start. Gaze is really important in this round table. A specialized mode of perceiving, thinking, being, seeing by knowers in the field. And what we're saying here is that the field of practice, the knowledge, shapes who the knower is and how they see what is important and what's not. The ability to notice what's going on, to discern between what's peripheral and what's more central. The different kinds of gazes that knowers have is conceptualized in the social plane, which is part of the 4K model. And as everything else in LCT, two relations that interplay off one another. And in the social plane, we've got the subjective relations, and that determines who is able to acquire the legitimate gaze, who can be knowers, who is able to learn this gaze. And then the interactive relations looks at the ways of knowing and how those are legitimized through interactions with significant others. For this round table, we're going to focus mainly on subjective relations. So how the field opens up or closes down who can get the gaze. So like everything else in LCT, the relation is defined on a continuum from stronger relations to weaker relations. And I'm going to just outline 3 levels of subjective relations that we're going to just touch on throughout the round table. So at the weakest level, where everyone is welcome, there's no restrictions on participation. The access embraces different actors of all kinds of dispositions. Anybody can come because the ways of thinking, the dispositions that matter in the field can be taught and learned. So you don't have to be a particular kind of knower in order to come into the field. So that would be regarded as the weakest subject relation that we're going to talk about today. Stronger than that is where access is conditional. So again, the dispositions and the ways of thinking can be taught and learned, but you've got to have something, and I've just put it there, a ticket, just as a kind of a way of representing that. The access is conditional. So for example, to get into a postgraduate diploma of higher education, you've got to have a bachelor's degree. To get into university, for example, a teacher education, you've got to have so many points that is based on your marks. So the access, once you've got that, that entrance requirement, you can come in, but there is some sort of condition on access. And the third level of subjective relations that I'm going to talk about is when the field very strongly controls who can get the gaze and who can't. And this is very often related to social categories, standpoint theory, which groups you belong to. It might be because you need certain personal dispositions, or you need a particular set of experiences in the past. But in that sense, when one's working with those stronger social subjective relations, the right of admission to the field or to the practice or to the gaze is reserved. You've got to be the right kind of knower in order to develop that gaze. It's not open to everybody, and it's not one that can be taught and learned in an open access environment. So that's going to frame the talk that we're going to do, because all of these 3 cases, the strength of subject relations impacts on what the knowers are able to do and what they're not able to do. So having said that, I'm now going to pass on to Nick, who's going to tell us a little bit more about his study.
Unmute. There we go. Thanks, Lee. As mentioned, I'm an electrical engineer, and shortly after graduating with my master's and starting with my PhD in electrical engineering, I started teaching. Now, at that stage, I saw teaching merely as a process of transferring my expert disciplinary knowledge to my students in the classroom. It was all about content. And of course, as an engineer at that stage, I didn't see teaching as being a practice in its own right, with its own internal rules and logics. And I effectively, in the same way as echoing McIntyre's position in the famous debate with Dunn, I effectively saw teaching as a conduit that transmits practice. The trained gaze that I had acquired rather through my time as an undergrad and postgrad in engineering, reinforced this idea further. And essentially, I saw that the expertise in the practice of engineering was equivalent to competence in the teaching of engineering. Yes, over the years, I became a better teacher, but I still at times felt very limited. There were times where things went wrong with my teaching or assessments in the classroom, and I was unable to explain why things went wrong or how to fix them. Essentially as a result of on-the-job training, really. Frustrated, I decided to join a postgraduate diploma in higher education with the hope that acquiring the knowledge of teaching rather, will be able to solve my problems. I thought it was going to be a walk in the park. I essentially assumed that the same rules would apply to education as they did to engineering. Well, I was met with quite a surprise. For those who don't know, the postgraduate diploma in higher education is a postgrad course at honors level, open to those who have a minimum of a bachelor's degree in anything and have some experience in teaching. There are 3 core courses: teaching and learning, assessment, and curriculum, where main theoretical positions are explored, and finishes off with a small research project. A bit more of that we'll talk about just now. So the whole pedagogy of the program is underpinned by fostering interactions with significant others in all the courses, throughout all the courses. These interactions are with, of course, the theorists and their researchers through all the prescribed readings in the course. Effectively engagement with these ideas through studying and reading. Engagement with peers, the other students, through discussions on very often on what was known as reading responses, essentially 1 or 2 page essays where a prescribed or a number of prescribed readings are discussed. At the level of the self, in terms of writing the responses and at the same time engaging in a rather strange discussion with the authors in the texts, and attempting essentially to make a position. And also engaging with the formative feedback received from the facilitators of the course. And all of these essentially help shape a way of knowing, a way of being. I entered this program essentially, as I said, with a trained gaze of an engineer, and had to go from there. Liam? About this research project. At the time, finishing off after those 3 core courses, I decided to play a bit with, actually, funnily enough, LCT, and try to research the journey through the engineering curriculum. But nonetheless, this engagement with this research project sparked a further interest in education, and especially seeing in myself a change in my own identity, academic identity, and also a change in my gaze towards education. I decided to take this further and enroll in the Master's in Education, and essentially chose to study my own experience. So my study was an autoethnographic one. And my empirical data was based on the weekly reading responses that I did in the course, coupled, of course, with the feedback I received from the facilitators. As you'll see, that's formed quite an important part of the work. I constructed a theoretical, a conceptual framework based on Guy's idea of identity as being recognized as a certain type of person by others. I brought in Archer's morphogenesis and especially reflexivity to explore this journey and this change of ways of being and knowing through the program. But most importantly, and this is going to be the focus of this talk, my analytical framework was based on the LCT dimension of semantics, where I chose to try and see how best one could actually see how meaning is constructed and infer essentially a change in gaze through the program. So, semantics. We've got two key concepts, semantic gravity, essentially the degree to which meaning is tied to context. In this case, the relative context dependence found within the reading responses, where there are, semantic density, effectively the complexity of meaning, speaking to the relative complexity within these reading responses. I defined four levels in terms of gravity, starting off my personal context, bound by my personal experiences, moving to SG+, moving to contents of the prescribed reading, moving further, exploring other readings, context of other readings, and ultimately leading to a general principle or theory. In terms of density, at its weakest, the description of simple descriptions of one idea or context, moving to an interpretation of this idea, moving further ST+ to linking different ideas together, different concepts, different readings, and ST++ now creating a network of interpretations leading to new meanings and new interpretations essentially. The whole point here is to see whether I was able to recognize what counts as legitimate effectively within education and whether I was able to realize it within my texts. These two concepts, of course, plotted on a plane, give us four distinct codes. We've got the prosaic code, where we've got simpler meanings and meanings are more strongly bound to context. We have the theoretical side of things, where we have the rhizomatic, more complex meanings, and meanings are more weakly bound to context. We have a sense of application, where more complex meanings, where we have more complex meanings and where meanings are more strongly bound to context, and they're rarefied, where we have simpler meanings and where meanings are more weakly bound to context. It'll be very interesting now to have a look at analyzing. I've chosen 3 responses from the beginning to the end, middle and end of the course, and how they pan out in terms of the semantic analysis. So my first reading response. So this was a response to the seminal 1999 Biggs article on constructive alignment, what the student does. And I had to write a response to it. I wrote a 2 to 3, what I thought was a nice 2 to 3 page essay. And what surprised me was the comment I got from the facilitator. Commenting and saying, well, your strength is in applying theory in a specific way to your teaching and learning situation. You report good results in your teaching and implicitly in student learning. I want to challenge you to look beyond your specific existing context to a wider, more complex, less context-bound world, that of theory. Can you think of limitations or weaknesses in the theory in relation to different learning and teaching situations? To be honest with you, when I received this feedback, I was I was taken aback and slightly surprised. I remember saying to myself, but of course I'm able to apply theory in a specific way. I am an engineer after all. What are you on about? Why are you complaining? Of course, bottom line is, I entered education with a blank gaze towards education. So I was exemplifying theory. I was putting theory above anywhere else. I was not willing to really, not able rather to challenge Big's position in any way. And here we can also see that the facilitator is guiding me towards looking at theory, thinking about theory in a different way, and playing theoretical positions against each other. Can you think of limitations and weaknesses in the theory? Having a look now at how this response plays out on the semantic plane, a very interesting pattern appears. Essentially, I start off in the prosaic code, where I describe my personal context. I then often move to the rarefied, where I present some form of platitude, go to the rhizomatic, and then back again. Essentially, from this, we can actually see that, again, I'm exemplifying theory. I'm not able to counter that theory. I'm just presenting it as the gospel truth and comparing it to my personal experiences. Again, a very clear evidence of a blank gaze towards education. Looking at the next response from the middle of the course, this was now assessment. A very different image appears. Here I'll start in the prosaic, again by describing my context, but then I move to the rhizomatic and I start playing off ideas against each other and also provide some meaningful positions in terms of application to teaching. And this is the first time I was able to, driven of course by the facilitator's comments early on in the course, I suddenly found myself able to stand my ground and argue that based on certain these concepts, I realized that rather focusing on whether a question is easy or difficult, one should actually be talking of whether a particular question is appropriate or not. Here, I'm clearly countering the position in the article and taking a stand. Moving on now to the last responsive question. This was actually, funnily enough, the last one I wrote in the course. A much more complex picture arises, starting off again in the prosaic, but then moving between a complex dance between the rhizomatic and the worldly takes place, where I start discussing theories against each other. I start presenting multiple implications of in the practice and comparing them back to theory. And I also end in the theoretical domain, essentially, where I provide further interpretations and meanings. Again, we can see over the process that something has definitely changed. The way of approaching this field has definitely changed. Moving on to a summary of what we've seen so far, one can clearly see that engagements with a structured program such as the PG Zip has indeed enabled me to acquire a new gaze and ultimately shift my identity. First of all, by exemplifying theory, that was the first stage. Again, movements between prosaic, rhizomatic, and rarefied. And then later on, positioning myself in debates and being able to lead to new insights into my own teaching context. Essentially, movements between rhizomatic, predominantly between rhizomatic and worldly. It's important to note here that it's not only the PG Zip that matters, that provides this avenue, although that was the vehicle really, but it's also one's personal agency and reflexivity that helps in this journey. Moving on, we started off the presentation with my very simplistic initial idea of seeing teaching rather as a conduit through which disciplinary expertise can simply be channeled to the students. And that was as a result of having a blank gaze towards education. As the course, as engagement in the course continues with practicing in reading responses, interaction with significant others, being essentially socialized with this new environment, I became aware of the complexity of not only teaching as a practice, but as a discipline itself. And being aware of the not only the pedagogic side of things in terms of there are things such as psychological theories of learning and assessment practices and theories and curriculum theories, but also there's the sociological aspect of things, pulling in the pedagogic device and being aware of the rules governing the selection of knowledge and the recontextualization and the reproduction within the classroom and the powers that govern these things, the rules that govern it. And also coming together with all of this is the agency, the awareness that one has the agency to intervene and change not only one's own practice, but also extending it to practice within the institution and the department, for starters, and institution in general, and starting conversations and starting planting the seeds really for change. So yes, moving on. So yes, so far what in summary, essentially in my work, we've got the what the institution values. Well, it's a certification for university teachers. Essentially, are you able to be aware of this greater process and be aware of the complexity of the issues? This, in terms of then the subjective relations, this contrasts quite a lot to Shimpa's work.
Okay, so
sorry, have I? Sorry.
No, that's great. Just before we summarize your study and start the conversation with others, I'd just like to invite anybody who's got a question or a comment for Nick to step in and engage with him before we move on.
Although you can also just jump in whenever you like afterwards as well. Anytime.
I'm Nick. This is Anna Vera from Copenhagen. I'm
Hello,
just
Vera.
thinking, hi. This is so interesting to hear. And it's just a comment really, that I'm so pleased to find out that it was, it seems like really powerful stuff that, because you're able to engage much more actively now in realizing and having trained and changed that gaze. So that's really cool. That's basically all I wanted to say.
Thank you.
Thanks, Anna Vera. Anybody else?
Yes, this is actually really more of a very small comment. Question. I really loved the animations that showed the movement on the semantic plane, for instance. I'm wondering, how did you make that? So I could see it being very useful.
Okay, that's done through animation with the PowerPoint.
That's just PowerPoint. Oh gosh.
Yeah. Okay.
Oh,
you can trace paths and let and have your animation trace the paths.
Thank you very much.
Okay. Good. Anything else?
While people are thinking, I'm just going to add that one of the valuable things about people looking at their own practice, like Nick has done, is that it doesn't require grants or the large-scale research projects or anything like that. You can start where you are and analyze what you're doing and your own trajectory without, you don't need to wait for, large-scale funding or funding of any kind. Just get on with things about yourself, which is, yeah, you do, yeah, and it's a powerful way. It's also quite powerful for engaging with other people in your field, in your subfield, so for example, in Nick's case, in engineering education or something like that, obviously people will have issues about generalization and so on, but the fact is that a well-constructed single case can have import for quite a lot of people and engage people, which is really, really important. Personal stories are a really, really important way of engaging people and getting people to connect with the ideas. Karen's got her hand up. Karen, jump in.
Thanks. I was just wondering whether all second career teachers have this epiphany for this moment, and whether it comes naturally, or whether people work to make sure that it does happen.
Sorry, Karen, I didn't get that.
Karen, we can't actually hear you. You're very, very quiet.
Yeah, we know that you're driving.
Okay, I'll talk close to the mic, sorry. And I've told the guys in the front to shut up. I was just wondering if all second career teachers do go through this process automatically, or whether, how do you force this to happen? These aha moments that about just do it. Does it happen to everyone, or is there a way to?
Karen, it's a difficult one. It's a difficult one to answer, because ultimately it does depend on, as I saw in my research, it does depend on agency as well as reflexivity. So in my particular case, I got frustrated with my teaching, and I decided to try and fix it, to try to take action and enroll for the speech dip and take it further. Yes, I hit a brick wall, and this is one of the important parts. I hit a brick wall in the beginning, and which led, of course, to quite a bit of consternation. And one can, at that stage, one can either throw in the towel and say, well, I'm done with this, or at least, or then move along slowly and do the bare minimum, or out of curiosity, as in my case, try and figure out what's going on. And that's fun. Other teachers might say, well, I've been doing this for so many years. Who's going to tell me now that I can't teach, or how to teach better? So yes, my experience is it's very difficult. Sometimes it's very difficult to force someone to say, well, you have to do it, because you might end up leading those people further away, kind of coming into the program with a negative outlook towards it. It is a difficult one. It really is. As someone been through the system, I can thoroughly say that it is absolutely indispensable. It's important, but the difficulty is.
Yeah. No, I'm saying, would you have had this transformation had you not been through a formal process where you were having a very particular, very specific kind of interactions? Would this have just suddenly, you realized it just through experience?
No.
On its own?
It was, no, a two-week crash course would not have fixed this. It required that intense interaction with others over a prolonged period of time. Yes, 2 years is not prolonged enough, but it is prolonged enough to start changing ways of thinking. A 2-week crash course is not going to do this.
Okay, great. Thanks for the question, Karen. And Vera, we can take one more question or one more comment.
No, hang on, Lee. No, Penny's also got a question as well.
Oh, sorry, I didn't see that.
Let it run.
Okay.
Oh, sorry, I didn't have my hand up.
No,
Thank you, Nick. My question in the chat was, you opened by talking about that linking of theories. So were you able to, and did you want to, did you need to bring in your expert gaze, your engineering knowledge into the new field? I was thinking of design knowledge, for example.
Yes, I did. But that only happened much later. In the first module, I was completely unable to do so. I did not know how. From the second module onwards, having gained a foundation in knowledge in education, I started finding myself able to start bringing in concepts even from engineering to explain issues in education. I approached some of my assignments in an engineering design manner in a way. So yes, it's not that I completely lost my engineering gaze and it was replaced by a gaze as a teacher. That gaze of an engineer was still present. It's just obviously acquiring, cultivating a new way of seeing it. And I actually found that being an engineer offered a different way of viewing education in a very useful manner.
Thank you. And I think perhaps the others in your degree also would have benefited from seeing that perspective as well.
Yeah.
AV, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, thanks. Nick, so I was wondering if at what point you were introduced to LCT and whether it was LCT that helped you make that transfer, or whether it was more sort of a tacit transition through the time spent and the comments that you got from your facilitators. Can you say anything about that?
Yes, in fact, it's a very funny story. I was introduced to LCT in my curriculum module, the third module in the course. And funnily enough, one of the facilitators spoke to me and said, you know what, there's this guy coming to speak at Wits Education. Are you coming tomorrow? So I said, well, that sounds interesting, I'll go. I went there and this guy spoke about semantics. Someone, Carl Mayton, I think his name was, of course, I had no clue who he was at the stage. So yes, I got introduced to semantics in curriculum. I attended a talk by Carl. It really opened my eyes in terms of a way of explaining things. And that was actually another seminal moment important moment in my journey, where I actually started seeing things. And LCT gave me a language to explain and describe and start working things through. In fact, my project the final project in my PhD was an LCT based idea study, whatever.
Thank you so much. That's really neat.
That's really cool, Nick. I mean, one of the things I just want to add as well is that you've highlighted something that I think is really important. I mean, I've written about knowledge blindness because it was just a way into, describe LCT. I mean, LCT isn't sociology of knowledge or of education. It's much wider than that, but it's a useful way in. But one of the other blind spots that is just as important is teaching blindness. That and it seems to go hand in hand often with knowledge blindness, but the yes. Complete blindness to the fact that teaching is its own logic, its own set of practices, that it is, the exactly same argument about the way in which academics see knowledge as a homogeneous and neutral medium through which content is sort of transmitted, even when they're saying they're, not using a transmission model.
Yes.
They still see knowledge as, a homogeneous and neutral medium, so they don't see differences in its forms and the effects those different forms might have. It's the same thing with teaching. So they don't see, against a backdrop of saying that transmission and instruction and variance on instruction, like instructivism or whatever you want to call it, instructional learning, whatever names, apart from seeing that as being bad and student learning, student-centered learning and, constructivism, progressivism and so on as being good, there's again a sense that that it doesn't have its own different forms and that those forms won't have effects beyond the yes. Hoped for effects that student-centered is good and nice and cuddly and huggy and pictures of kittens and rainbows and so on. So, but the teacher blindness, I've noticed, teaching blindness, I've noticed increasingly over the last few years. It's really hit me that when you work in areas like science education or educational technology, for example, there is just this total lack of study of teaching, so that learning is just usurped teaching as an object of study. And teachers just need to get out of the way effectively. So I think it's a really important point.
Okay, great. Thanks so much. So in just pulling out a few points from Nick's study, so what we want to say here is that the subject relations were quite weak. Nick did have a degree, well, he had a PhD in engineering. He also worked at a university. He also had some teaching experience, and that's what gave him access to the PG DIP. He felt the need to get a certificate, a teacher's qualification, and that aligned really nicely with what the institution valued. And so he was prepared to submit himself and assimilate into the activities that would be required to get this new gaze in addition to the gaze that he already had. And it was quite a transformative process. But in that whole process, the university didn't need to transform itself. Nick worked within the structures. We're going to move on now to Shimpa's research on Jewish studies and see how actors and the institution don't position themselves in quite the same way as in Nick's study. So Shimpa, over to you.
Great, thanks, Lee. And hello, everyone. I'd like to begin by kind of framing the discussion with the broad question of schooling. What is the purpose of schooling? And with many answers to this question, I'd like to highlight two positions, or sort of two constellations. Starting on the left-hand side, there's the position, those that say that school functions as a disruption of everyday roles. The child who enters the school is no longer son or daughter. The child becomes student. The adult who works in the school is a teacher, and teachers don't work to the productive rhythm of the rest of the economy. Even knowledge and skills that enter the school get transformed into becoming subject matter. School is sort of a suspension, and that's a very useful thing according to this way of saying it. Critics of this approach, on the right-hand side of my table, critics maintain that school therefore is inherently alienating. It alienates the child from the everyday. And they maintain rather that school should be closely aligned to everyday roles, form an extension of the students' everyday life. School really functions to reinforce a student's culture or home life or experiences, and should be clearly linked to these kinds of things. The other position, the one we started with, the first position, maintains that school should move students beyond this, exposing them to things that they don't know or that they couldn't know without the schooling experience. As an example, an interesting example of this, turn to religious education. And I've put here two different examples. So knowledge about religion as different from religious knowledge. And to highlight the difference between these two, I'd like to take the South African example. South Africa has a national policy on religion and education that was introduced in 2003. And essentially it instituted a policy of religion education and not religious education. That is the right of a religious school to teach and practice religiously was perceived as exclusionary and undemocratic. Initially, that actually applied to all schools in the state, not just public schools. Eventually, the policy only applied to public schools, independent schools being allowed to practice and teach religiously. To take an Australian example, in Australia, you have the same kind of distinction and actually have two different subjects. You've got something called general religious education and special religious education. So general religious education is teaching students about religions, different religions, the way that people practice them, and the different religious worldviews and such like. Not necessarily the student's own culture or background, but it's teaching about the diversity of religions. Special religious education, on the other hand, is a form of religious knowledge where the school is teaching the affiliated religion, the religion that the school is affiliated to, trying to induct students into a religious way of being and religious knowledge. With that kind of framing, I'd like to point out that in religious schools face an interesting question in this regard, and that is, how does the affiliated religion interact with the curriculum? Religious schools in general, or at least some religious schools, want or expect the affiliated religion to permeate through all aspects of the school. And so it raises the question for them, how does the affiliated religion then influence, impact, shape what goes on in general studies lesson, in the general studies curriculum? This is sort of regardless of which religion the school is affiliated to, they all face this question. In South Africa, there's a literature on Muslim, Christian, and Jewish faith-based schools in this regard, with the literature on Muslim schooling being the most robust in terms of this question. And the Jewish schooling literature is mostly based in America on this question. So for at least some schools, they maintain or they introduce this idea of curriculum integration, where the affiliated religion is deeply integrated into what goes on in the rest of the school, and especially within general studies lessons. There's a bringing together of the religious education component of the school with the general studies component of the school. In Muslim context, it's called the Islamization of Knowledge. Fattar writes about this amongst others, and it's seen as an ideal. In the popular materials that schools put out, such as like mission statements or brochures and advertising on websites, curriculum integration is purported as this educational ideal. And also in the scholarly literature, as I mentioned, in the Islamization of Knowledge, or in Jewish education in American context, that's spoken about just directly as curriculum integration. There is also, just by the way, South African literature, but it's smaller and in Jewish schools, and they also talk about curriculum integration. While it's theoretically a wonderful idea, in practice, it seems to largely have been a failure, where essentially the process becomes some sort of symbolic add-on, where general studies teachers, although they know perhaps that they should be integrating curriculum, they tend to just do it on a very symbolic level, where Fattar calls it, instead of having Islamization of knowledge at a deep level, it just becomes a symbolic add-on. So the empirical evidence points to this being difficult to actually implement. Yet few of those empirical studies actually present convincing arguments about why that is so. They generally focus on the merely technical details, such as teachers not having enough time to plan together, or lessons not being long enough to do curriculum integration. And so my study, where I wanted to go with it, was really to try get deeper, to dig a little bit deeper, to look at the constraining factors over here, but at a conceptual level. I felt that there was something here at a conceptual level that we could kind of untangle and see why it's difficult to implement, and why we've got this sort of quite widespread across religious institutions failure. Thank you. So I asked 3 questions. The first question was sort of a very basic question, which was, what are teachers' attitudes towards curriculum integration? This was a simple kind of collection of attitudes and beliefs towards these demands from schools, religious schools, to integrate the religious education component with the general studies teaching. Question 2, which is the main focus of today and the main focus of my analysis, which is turning to a Jewish context, what matters most in teaching and learning Jewish studies in the school I studied? And within that, I wanted to understand how do teachers see the Jewish studies knowledge? And how do teachers then, in question 3, I asked, how do teachers enact curriculum integration, bringing it around? I just want to point out that question 3 isn't the topic of today, and I don't actually return to it. I just want to highlight it as part of my study, that I was bringing it back to curriculum integration. Just on question 2, I broke that down into 3 parts. I wanted to understand who is the envisaged student? Who is the envisaged student of Jewish studies? So I asked teachers, who is the ideal sort of graduate from the school Jewishly? So I focused on the student. Then I asked, who's the Jewish studies teacher? What qualities and roles must the teacher have to teach Jewish studies? So the student, then the teacher. And then lastly, I spoke to the subject matter, the nature of Jewish studies as a subject. What matters most in the subject? What's the basis of achievement? The school I conducted the study in was a Jewish primary school in South Africa. It's co-educational, around 350 students, the majority of whom self-identify as Jewish. The secular subjects broadly follow the national curriculum. Teachers do exercise autonomy, but they follow it quite broadly. The Jewish studies curriculum is completely internal, and 70% of the teachers self-identify as Jewish. It's not a requirement of the school in terms of admitting students or teachers to be Jewish per se. Thank you. So my participants were Jewish studies teachers, and then especially for the purposes of today, the following 2 groups: secular subject teachers who are Jewish, and then secular subject teachers who are not Jewish. There's a mixture. My data consisted of a questionnaire, semi-structured interviews, and also document analysis of things like the school mission, and as we'll see shortly, job adverts. I think an interesting example. In my study, I used the specialization dimension. As we know, specialization asks what matters most for achievement in this institution, in this subject or a course. It's based on the premise that knowledge is always about something and by someone. There's always someone doing the knowing, setting up 2 distinct, analytically distinct relations that between knowledge and its object of study, called epistemic relations, and social relations between knowledge and its subject or its author. My translation device, how specialization was used in this study. So in this case, starting with stronger epistemic relations, which was an emphasis on kind of the knowledge, principles, and procedures of Jewish studies, whereas epistemic relations being weaker is where these things, such as knowledge, principles, and procedures of Judaism and Jewish studies, are less important. In terms of the social relations, thank you. In terms of the social relations, here the emphasis is on personal experience, dispositions of being a Jewish person, as a Jewish person. Whereas with social relations, it refers to these things being less important. Being a Jewish person is less important. Looking at the specialization plainly, starting with the knowledge code, this is where knowledge of subject matter, not the knowledge of the subject of Jewish studies, the subject matters the most, matters much more than actually the person being Jewish. Going diagonally down to the Noah code, here the knowledge of the subject doesn't matter nearly as much as being Jewish matters. And then, of course, the elite code where both of these things matter, and the relativist codes where the knowledge of the subject of Jewish studies really doesn't matter, and being Jewish doesn't matter either. Anything goes. So to launch into my data, just as an example, it's useful to provide this comparison between a job advert for a general studies teacher. This was for a grade 4 locum teacher, and then the same year, a job advert for a new head of Jewish studies. So I've put it more into the knowledge code. It's more knowledgey stuff with one piece that's more knowery in this advert. And I've just transcribed the first couple lines. The successful candidate will be qualified, a registered teacher, and then have specific subject knowledge. And then in the Noah code, a little bit further down, is have experience teaching grade 4. But the emphasis here, you can see it's stronger epistemic relations and weaker social relations, especially useful when you compare it to the head of Jewish studies advert. If you can bring that one up. Here, the successful candidate will be, this is verbatim, an inspirational educator, a superb role model, and Jewish law observant of Jewish law, and doesn't go on to enumerate teaching qualifications or subject knowledge. And so that is a downplaying of epistemic relations and really an emphasis on the social relations. That's kind of just a way in to showing the Noah code of Jewish studies in the school, which I'll try to provide a few more examples of now. On this slide, we've got a discussion here about where essentially participants are responding to a prompt about being a teacher in a Jewish school, and specifically, what would they feel, or would they feel competent to take Jewish studies knowledge and integrate it into their own general studies lessons. So these are secular subject teachers, these are general studies teachers, and they're responding to this requirement, potential requirement or requirement to actually teach Jewish knowledge within their lessons. On the left at the top, we've got stronger subjective relations, and below it, we've got the weaker subjective relations. So looking at the top quote, here the teacher says, I think there's nothing that you can learn in a book about a sense of what Jewishness means. I think you need to grow up in a Jewish home. So for this teacher, having Jewish knowledge and understanding what Jewishness is about is really something that you're born into a family, you have the correct upbringing with all that entails, interacting with family members, maybe within the context of a community, and that's what gives you knowledge. That's how you come to possess Jewish knowledge. No matter how much you study from a book, it's not really going to give you that sense of Jewishness. So quite stronger subjective relations. Comparably, the bottom quote, speaking as someone who is not Jewish and someone who doesn't have a lot of information and knowledge about Judaism to integrate it, remember that the participants responding to this requirement to integrate curriculum. I'm just thankful that I've got colleagues who can guide me. I myself am not knowledgeable enough to be confident to stand up there and talk about it freely without having rehearsed it, basically. There have been opportunities to learn more about it, but I haven't been able to do that. Family-wise in school, it's just hectic. So the issue for this teacher is not that she's not Jewish and therefore doesn't possess the right gaze. The issue for her is she's not Jewish and therefore just simply doesn't have the knowledge. She hasn't learned the knowledge. And in fact, when she can rely on her colleagues to tell her the information and then she goes back and rehearses it, she would feel comfortable integrating the Jewish knowledge into her lessons, teaching about it. At the end, it's actually explicit, where she says that you can learn Jewish knowledge, and there have been opportunities. She acknowledges that it's definitely feasible. It's just practically she hasn't been able to. So in this case, Jewish knowledge is seen as learnable. It doesn't matter really who you are. It's seen as something that's definitely learnable. Weaker subjective relations. Yeah. I think this is my second last example. This is about the qualities of a Jewish studies teacher. So these are, again, the same teachers, these secular subject teachers, general studies teachers, who are responding to the question, what does it take to be a Jewish studies teacher? So the first respondent in the knowledge code at the top left says they would need to know a lot about the subject. So I don't necessarily agree that you have to be Jewish. As you'll see shortly, this wasn't a prominent kind of position to take at all. This is quite unique, but this is a stronger emphasis on subject knowledge, a downplaying of who the person is religiously, a knowledge code. The Noah code, and this is an interesting one, says, I think you have to live what you are preaching, and especially for primary school children, imbuing a certain way of living. And I think you have to be that kind of role model. So for this teacher, what's important in terms of being a teacher of Jewish studies is that they are a role model, that they are an embodiment of a way of living, sense, a feeling of Jewishness. And through living as that embodiment within the school, students then role model and learn from that somehow to what it means to be Jewish. So in this teacher's view, school is sort of functioning, just to go back to my initial slide, as an extension of everyday roles. The way of life that's in the home is being brought into the school by this embodied teacher who's role modeling for the students. And so that's more Noah-y stuff. This is a dominant code throughout my data. The Noah code is dominant throughout my data, and I just want to show that and highlight that point in the next slide, if I remember my slide order. Yes, okay, so I know it's a little bit wordy, but I was trying to just capture what my study organizing framework was. Sorry, I've got the question one out of order, but my first question, just to remind you, was about teachers' attitudes and beliefs. And here, what the data showed was that teachers have a strong desire and they are happy to contribute to the Jewish ethos, regardless of who they are. They understand it, they feel that it's important. And in terms of curriculum integration, they say and maintain that it's important. They're happy with the requirement. They think it's an important thing to do as a Jewish school, to integrate Jewish studies into their general studies lessons. And they think that everyone should be involved with that. And where then for question 2, this is where I use specialization. Starting with the envisaged student, who's the ideal graduate of the school, Jewishly. So here in this data, it was very, very clear that student dispositions far outweigh anything else. And the 2 most prominent kind of affective outcomes or behavioral outcomes that were emphasized in the data were that they should be proud of their identity, pride of their Jewishness. And then secondly, that they should develop a sense of community, of being part of the Jewish community. And pointing out here that there was a distinct absence of any mention of subject knowledge. And so it was a Noah code. I coded it as a Noah code. In terms of the teacher, we've seen a little bit of this already in the examples. Teachers maintained that to be a Jewish studies teacher, you have to have some sort of personal commitment to Judaism. Now, of course, that actually was the subject of debate. What extent do you have to be committed to Judaism, or what role does it play in your life? But the point for us today is that it was about a personal commitment, living religiously or being a Jewish person. And as I said, role modeling. downplaying any need for subject knowledge, actually quite sometimes explicitly downplaying teaching qualifications or prior experience in NOAA code. And then lastly, in terms of the subject matter, how do teachers perceive Jewish studies subject matter? As we saw in that quote from the teacher about being brought up Jewish, to possess knowledge about Judaism, you have to have been brought up Jewish, which downplays the role of study. And so I quoted that as a NOAA quote, but this is now the point of my talk. There was enough evidence of teachers or data that said some maintain that Jewish studies is learnable. And that was the quote that I provided. So there was a substrand of a knowledge code. There was enough to kind of pique my interest and figure out what's going on over here. Yeah, that's fine. Thank you, Lee. And just visually, this is how I see what was going on, where you had this dominant NOAA code, but enough knowledge code to crop up. And this was the first point that LCT really got me thinking, because it highlighted this very quickly. And I'll describe what I think is going on over here. For me, Jewish studies here is being described in two different contexts. And it shifts. There's a code shift that goes on between these contexts, where Jewish studies on its own, as a subject on its own, when teachers describe that and talk about that, Jewish studies is a NOAA code. But in a new context in curriculum integration, where Jewish studies is part of a project of curriculum integration, we have more of a knowledge code. So firstly, what work does this do? Why is this happening? And then I'll talk to very briefly a little bit more of a detail on the mechanics of how it happens. So I think the reason for this shift, the work that it does for teachers, for participants, is quite straightforward. If Jewish studies is being required to be integrated into general studies lesson, and if Jewish studies is a NOAA code, then that by definition means there's a NOAA gaze that is legitimate. Not all teachers in the school possess that legitimate NOAA gaze, which then creates a thorny dilemma for the school and for the teachers, because how can you expect those teachers to integrate Jewish knowledge into their general studies lesson? It simply doesn't work. And so to facilitate that demand, to manage that demand for curriculum integration, teachers necessarily have to shift to a knowledge code, where by weakening the social relations, we invite more teachers, or we make it feasible for more teachers to enter into this project of curriculum integration. So that's why. A little bit about the how, and maybe while we switch slides, to mention that obviously an integration study would have done really nicely with autonomy. That's for future use, but I stuck only to specialization. So a little bit about the how. This is how I see it. The two different contexts are Jewish studies in general and Jewish studies in the context of curriculum integration. And teachers are pulling on different parts of Jewish studies. For Jewish studies in general, they are seeing Jewish studies as religious knowledge, where the object of Jewish studies is to provide students with this comprehensive view of Judaism. It's a NOAA code. Whereas with Jewish studies in curriculum integration, the knowledge code, yes, it allows more teachers into the project, but it shrinks what knowledge is being drawn on. And teachers here are drawing on knowledge about religion, essentially just any facts about Judaism that will do the job of curriculum integration. Thank you. Lee, you muted? Yeah.
Thanks, Shimpa. Is that a moment for people to jump in, or I had a thought, which is that this is such a you've got an example of such a really widespread issue, not just about religious teaching, but about so many things where the knowledge of the group or the knowledge associated with the group is argued for by members of that group, and then they rely on a social knower code. And then the attempt to, then there's always a big debate as to whether it should be integrated or kept to that group, to members of that group. And I was just going to, so I think this is one first point, is that this is an issue with really wide ramifications well beyond Jewish studies and well beyond religious studies, also to all social groups who have come into higher education and education over the last 150 years, the working class, women, female, feminist knowledge, ethnicity, sexuality, region, religion, as well as religion. So I think that you're tapping into an issue that's got really wide ramifications well beyond religious studies. So that's something to remember when you're sort of, marketing this stuff, as it were, is that this is a very generalized issue, which is what the theory can enable you to do. And the other second point I was just going to briefly make, which is that just keep your eye on the fact that it is a social knower code. There is a stepping stone potentially between there and a knowledge code, which is the cultivated knower code, where teachers in a school, for example, could be non-Jewish, but engage in integration, not on a knowledge code basis, but on a kind of cultivated knower code basis of contact and discussion and guidance or mentoring or whatever it might be with their Jewish teacher colleagues, so that the Jewish teacher colleagues become their significant others. So it's all about the interaction relations with significant others, the Jewish teachers, which then becomes a kind of cultivated kind of knower code. So it doesn't have to be just set up as a dichotomy between those two things, which is potentially a strategic move for those people who are advocating not only for knowledge, a bunch of knowledge to be brought in, but also and legitimated and viewed, but also they're usually trying to make an argument for their own position at the same time. And this is a kind of compromise potential, has compromise potential because it maintains a role for those actors whilst at the same time opening up the space for other actors to engage with that knowledge without being told, no, you can't because you're not Jewish or black or gay or female or whatever it might be. I'm not saying that's the answer. I'm just saying keep your eye open for that potential cultivated knower code to be in the mix, in the data somewhere.
Interesting, thank you.
Okay, thanks. And is there anybody else who'd like to make a comment or ask a question of Shimpa at this point? Okay, so then I'm going to continue. So what the institution valued matched what the teachers valued, and that was the integration of Jewish studies across the curriculum. And as been mentioned, these were much stronger subjective relations that required a social gaze, but the non-Jewish teachers who were committed to that integration didn't have that social gaze, couldn't get that social gaze, but they could still meet requirements through other means, and they found a way to do that. But there again, no change was required to the institution. The institution, what the institution valued, stayed constant, and that was really the point at which we thought, are these the only two reactions that can happen if a gaze is missing? The one that Nick was showing is that a new gaze is acquired, and in Shimpa's case, the actors who can't acquire the gaze then accommodate in some way by shifting their practices. And so it gave us this opportunity to kind of look at other possibilities and saying, if the knowers don't have the legitimate gaze that is valued by the institution, is there other things that can happen? And that made us think of a situation, and I'm going to just talk about it very, very briefly, relating to the protests that happened over the last couple of years in South African higher education. So one of the things that the higher education sector had to deal with in South Africa is their segregation past, the fact that higher educations, like other facilities and amenities in South Africa, have in the past been racially segregated. And although institutions were opened up to people of all races a long, long time before the end of apartheid, one of the priorities after the end of apartheid was to not just ensure that students of all races were in the institutions, but actually how to support them. And Wally Morrow, at that point, just after the end of apartheid, really gave South Africa a very, very powerful distinction between the formal access, which is the ability to enroll and attend a course, and epistemological access, which is, even if you're sitting in the class and you're attending along with everybody, are you getting access to the knowledge and the skills that are being learned? And so for a long time, since the end of apartheid, the discourse in higher education has really focused on how do we enable epistemological access. And that carried on until 2015, where higher education institutions really assumed that they were offering a meritocracy, and those students who were hardworking, who attended, were engaged, would achieve, and you deserve your fail if you fail. And really, what epistemological access does is it ignores the knowers, it ignores the social categories, and it ignores the ways in which structures either marginalize or exclude students. And so really the focus was on assimilating students who were previously excluded into existing structures. So there was a weakening of subjective relations in that those who, for example, were excluded from certain institutions on the basis of race were now able to gain formal access. But as Slee says, if you don't attend to the knowers and who they are, what you can have a situation is that some students remain as tenants on the margins of the institution. In other words, the access opens up, but actually they are not fully feel and included as legitimate knowers in this institution or this space. And it was then in 2015 that one of the students, Chumani Makwele, took a bucket of poo and poured it over the statue of Cecil John Rhodes, which is right in the prime position of the University of Cape Town. The frustration all condensed around this symbol of the statue. And that sparked what was the Rhodes Must Fall protests. And they started at University of Cape Town and very soon spread across South Africa. And what I think I want to just talk about here is that it's not just the removal of the statue. It was condensed into that as a symbol. What really became clear as the memorandum of demands was issued was that there was a call or a demand to end institutionalized racism and patriarchism, which included removing the statues that commemorated white supremacists. It included renaming buildings and roads. It included embracing the experiences that Black students and academics felt were not part of the institutional culture and what they saw around them. They felt visitors in what remained a colonial space. So there was the call not just to remove the statue, but to reconsider the curricula that didn't address European demands and concerns and priorities, but really that addressed African issues and embraced the experiences of Black people. Students were very concerned that part of this process was going to deal with issues of why there were so few Black academics teaching them. What was it about the institution that was that Black academics were not represented in proportion? Why is it that a disproportionate number of Black students became academically excluded because they didn't meet minimum requirements of the course? And why was it that, for example, somebody who's an academic would have a staff bursary for their children to access tertiary education, but a gardener or a cleaner or a security worker working in the university, their children didn't get those same benefits? And processes for reporting institutional racism on campus. So these were not just about the statue, it was a whole collection of what the university and the institution values and how the students didn't read themselves into those spaces. And so although access was no longer dependent on racial categories, there was the sense that the subjective relations of the institution needed to weaken further to embrace a greater diversity and categories of actors who were coming into those spaces, not as visitors, not as tenants on the margins of the institution, but as legitimate knowers whose priorities, whose experiences would be acknowledged and valued by the institution. And that set the stage then for a bigger protest of fees must fall, where the demand became for free, decolonized quality education across South Africa. And that's really where we are grappling with. So the discourse has changed from formal access to epistemological access to what it really means to provide this free, decolonized quality education. And that's really, really permeated the debates in South Africa about higher education and the exclusionary structures in the universities. So what I want to do now is just to bring those three case studies together. So let's start with, what is the institution value? Nick?
In my case, effectively, it was the certification for university teachers. Teachers becoming aware of their role as a teacher and being able, acquiring the agency to actually engage with their own teaching and make the, I suppose, teaching a better place. In terms of the subjective relations, as we said, they were weaker. Anyone could enter as long as they had a bachelor's degree minimum and they had some teaching experience. They were actually the university teachers.
Okay, so let's
in
go
my
to Nick.
case,
Sorry, to
sorry.
Shimpa.
Shimpa,
Yeah.
sorry.
In my case, teachers, the institution values this idea that the religious education should permeate throughout the whole school in the form of curriculum integration, which I mentioned is stronger subjective relations.
And in the case of fees must fall, roads must fall and fees must fall, what the institution valued was assimilation into the dominant culture, and subjective relations had been weakened, but certainly not sufficiently so. Okay, back over to Nick.
In my case, I entered the program with the trained gaze of an engineer, legitimating knowledge, principles, procedures. What was missing was effectively a gaze towards education. I entered that space with a blank gaze towards education, which is quite different to what Shimpa's was about.
Yeah, in my case, the thing that was missing was this social gaze that is really quite difficult to acquire. Seems really very difficult to acquire for anyone, as opposed to in the roads must fall,
where the institutional culture kept, as it always was, and expected the students to assimilate into that. And we're going to look now at the responses of the social actors and then what was required of the institutions. So over to Nick.
In my case, it was a process of submitting to the learning activities. One is expected to engage with the readings, engage with your peers, engage with especially with the practice of writing responses. And that was the beginning or sparked the cultivation of a new gaze. Nothing, of course, was required from the institution to change.
Whereas in my case, it's really hard for social actors, as I mentioned, to cultivate anything, or notwithstanding Carl's comment, which I'll of course think about carefully. And so here teachers have to sort of perform this shift to a knowledge code in order to meet the demands required of them. And nothing changes from the institutional side.
So the thing that we felt was really important just to bring up in this conversation is that unlike the other two, in the roads must fall, the students said, we demand to be recognized as legitimate knowers, and the institution needs to change, the culture needs to change, and they demand of the culture, of the institution, a weakening of the subjective relations. And so if we just have a look at the three studies, in the one, the institution claimed legitimacy and the actors needed to accommodate. And that happened when the field of Jewish studies had a very much stronger subjective relations, which were not accessible to all. In the other case of Nick's, the institution claims legitimacy and the actors need to assimilate, and they do that by acquiring a new gaze. In the third case, the actors were the ones who claimed their legitimacy, and the institution was challenged to change and to make the accommodations there. And so just in summary, we took Mayton's challenge seriously. Could we find a way that very different studies that enact LCT could speak to one another through the theory? And offer a more integrated account of how actors and how institutions respond when they don't have a legitimate gaze. But it also opened up something for us, because when we just looked at Shimpa and Nick's studies in relation to one another, we looked for possibilities beyond those studies. And that's what led us to say, is it only the actors that have to work as individuals to make accommodations or assimilations? Or is there something that challenges the structures and challenges the field? And we know that LCT not only gives us the tools to analyze, but also to transform. And that's what we tried to look at here. So being a sociology of possibilities and being able to see connections that we hadn't seen before. And I'm going to leave it at that. And thank you for being here. But before we close off, just to mention that LCT 3.5 is happening. It's around the world. It's around the clock. We're going to start it off in January the 18th at 4 o'clock Sydney time. And we go on a 65-hour online broadcast from one group in the world to the next. So they're going to be global events, they're going to be regional sessions, and some places where it's possible to have social outings, those are going to happen too. So if you're not yet a member of a group, go to the Legitimation Code Theory website, go and look at who is the coordinator in your region, and do get in contact with them, because it's going to be brilliant. So on that note, thank you very much. Carl, do you want
is there anybody that wants to you know, I know we're over what we normally have as time, but doesn't mean you have to rush off. Does anybody have any kind of like comments or discussions or whatever? I mean, we've had some things in the chat from people saying it's great.
It's Carol
Just
here. I
jump
wonder
in.
if I could.
Oh, hi, Carol.
Hi.
Yes.
Thanks so much. For me, I was just thinking, you know, the thing with the roads, it's kind of, I guess, this idea of who actually legitimates the gaze and to what extent the actors accept that gaze. I mean, the whole thing with Roads Must Fall was that students were actually saying, we don't like this gaze. We don't want to be assimilated into this gaze that, you know, kind of, what's the word, supports a very European understanding of knowledge. We want to, so it wasn't just the social relations, but I think very much an upsetting of the epistemic relations, of actually saying, what you think you're teaching us, we don't actually want to know. And I wondered how LCT talks about that kind of structural, it's kind of like almost saying, you know, the hegemony of the knowledge that is being taught in universities, we want to overthrow that. Is there, I mean, I guess it's the biggest structural issue that I'm interested in, not so much, and I'm just wondering how LCT talks to those sort of structural issues. I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah, thanks,
It's
Carol.
really the question of the powerful knowledge. So who makes that knowledge powerful? Who says the knowledge? Well, we know who says it, but I guess the Roads Must Fall movement was saying, we don't accept what you are telling us is powerful knowledge.
I think that that's quite right. I mean, that was it was a whole challenge to everything. To me, the LCT gives us the tools to see what is, and where those challenges are coming and the basis of those challenges. But I don't know, I wouldn't think that it would give us the answers as to how, you know, what dominance is right and wrong and so on, but it gives us the tools to start making it visible, what's hidden. And then I suppose one would need to turn to decolonial theory, critical theory, and so on, to really unpack the issues. But then one could operationalize them. But I think that there is a book.
You just use the tools to analyze the way in which the competing claims are working. So, you know, not only did they reject, they actually construct, the famous full thing constructs what is being taught as being a particular code, you know, as being a social code, the knowledge of a particular group in some cases. And that's a construction of what they're saying power is based on. And then they're offering a different, or potentially the same, because you can sometimes get the same thing being replaced with a, you know, just swapping out the social group. So, I mean, it's these are tools for analysis in order to understand what it is people are doing. It's not the tools can be used to generate conjectures about what is happening and what may happen and what should happen, but the framework itself doesn't offer any normative model about that. Oh, Marissa just asked me to read out a question. Were there reactionary students that contested the process, for example, by arguing that decolonization had no place in science or anything like that? Was there a kind of counter move push against? I think what Mauricio is asking was there a counter push against decolonization at all? Were people saying this has no place in science, for example?
Yeah. So I think what was great was the LCT panel at LCT.
Lee. Mauricio is asking whether there was in South Africa a push against this social Noah code kind of argument about the knowledge being taught is the knowledge of imperial white Western people.
Yeah.
Where there are people saying, no, in science there should be no, there isn't, it's not like that. And there's no place for decolonization in science or engineering. That's what Mauricio is asking.
Yeah. So I was going to say that Hanali and Mag spoke to that issue in part of the decolonization panel in LCT 3. In LCT 3. And they said that the work that they had been doing in the science faculty, for example, at Stellenbosch University, there was a very strong push against understanding that from the science faculty, and how they used LCT tools to open up conversations that would have been impossible. But yes, there was very much a push against that.
Interesting. Yeah. I hope that answered your question, Mauricio. Any other comments or questions? So I think it's really fascinating that you can get, like we had, so Nick was using semantics and Shimpa was using specialization, and we kind of, you know, seamlessly moved between two different dimensions of LCT without it feeling at all like a, you know, kind of jarring shift or anything like that. Both of them giving us insights into this issue of people coming in, the dispositions between, basically they're both about, as well as the piece small thing, is about when you have dispositions, or what people bring, what knowers bring, and then what the set of practices they're encountering maybe like, or what the rules of the game are in a particular place. And I think that's really fascinating, personal journey and a more kind of institutional one, and then a much bigger structural one. And we can use LCT to analyze the organizing principles of how those things come together and in different ways. I think that's really fascinating.
Okay, well, thank you very much, everybody.
Thanks everybody for being here from all around the world and for all your comments. And Mauricio will keep the chat and send it through, won't you? Yeah, thumbs up. Yeah, cool. And we'll also post this at some point in the future as well. So thank you very much, everybody, for being here today. And thanks to Nick, Shimpa, and Lee for taking us seamlessly through such different areas of study and so on. And this is that bit at the end of Zoom talks where it's this kind of like lame lack of, kind of like, the applause that we're kind of so used to sealing off stuff. So yeah, there's kind of like waving hands and some icons and so on, and a lot of thank yous in the chat. So thanks everybody for being here, and also thanks to you three for doing great roundtables, very stimulating. I hope this stuff gets published. Several people have said so as well.
Thanks so much. Thanks, Carl. Thanks, Mauricio.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
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 Bye. Thank you so much.